Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we unpack sources and pull out the most valuable insights for you.
And today, we're really focusing on just one source, but it's incredibly insightful. It's an interview exploring adult ADHD.
Right, but not just the clinical side, not the deficit model.
Exactly. It frames it as a fundamentally different way of experiencing the world, of engaging with everything.
So our mission here is to really get under the skin of that lived experience, using this personal testimony.
We'll look at the challenges, sure, but also the unexpected strengths.
And crucially, the tools. What else someone navigate this? Thrive, even. Okay, let's get into it.
So the voice we're hearing from in this source, it's Caroline Berger de Fémynie.
Ah, yes. Many people might know her from the Pilates world. Founder of Studio Biopilates Paris, she's an educator.
And she even has her own podcast, the Biopilates Deep Dive. But this interview, it's much more personal.
She talks about living with undiagnosed ADHD. For what, over 40 years?
Yeah, over 4 decades. And she decided to speak out because, well, she felt the silence around adult ADHD, especially for women, was just too heavy.
It's about naming something invisible, giving it reality.
Right. And the hope, she says, is that her story helps others maybe see themselves or just find some peace by, putting a name to what they're going through. It's not a complaint.
No, it's more like shedding light on it, an illumination.
Exactly.
So let's rewind a bit in her story from the interview. How did she even begin to suspect this? Because ADHD wasn't a term she grew up with, right?
Not at all. The signs were there, sure, but they got different labels. She was called ultra quick or bursting with ideas.
Or that classic one, brilliant but chaotic.
That's the one. Those are the descriptions she heard, the early signals.
So when did things start to shift? When did the idea of ADHD actually surface for her?
Well, the turning point came quite a bit later, tied into her professional life, actually, during some really intense Sto Pilates training. She mentions a specific conversation with her trainer, Monique Lavoie. Just a conversation, but it planted a seed, a possibility.
But just a seed. It wasn't an immediate diagnosis.
No, the decision to actually consult a professional, that didn't happen until she was around 40.
Wow. Okay. And think about that timing. This is after she'd already built this incredibly successful career.
Right. Major milestones achieved. Her own dance company, even. It wasn't like she was failing.
So what prompted it then?
It seems it was this dawning realization, that feeling of being constantly overwhelmed or just how things are. Maybe it wasn't temporary. Maybe it was like a lifelong neurological thing.
That feeling wasn't fleeting. It was just inherent.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful things in this source is how she describes the daily experience. She calls it attention that captures everything all the time.
Captures everything, like cognitive hypersensitivity? Is that the term she used?
Yes, cognitive hypersensitivity.
What does that actually feel like day to day? Can you elaborate based on the source?
She paints a vivid picture. Everything is stimulated, like everything. The fridge humming, a word someone misplaces, a random thought.
It all demands attention at the same time.
Simultaneously. It's not selective attention. It's just open floodgates.
Wow. Does that create a sense of urgency around everything?
Totally. Everything feels urgent. Or potentially super interesting. Or maybe a source of anxiety. It's this constant swing.
Between what?
Between intense hyperfocalization, like laser focus on one thing, and then total dispersion, where attention just shatters and goes everywhere.
That sounds exhausting, frankly.
It does. And it impacts emotions, too.
How so?
Well, she says it amplifies them. Frustration, anger, even joy, they're all felt much more intensely.
But she's clear this isn't about being immature emotionally.
Right. She ties it directly to neurochemistry. Her phrase is unforgettable, living with a brain that burns quickly.
A brain that burns quickly. That really paints a picture. Okay, so how does this fiery brain translate into professional life? Because as we said, she's achieved so much.
Well, it's a double-edged sword, On one hand, she says it's the source of overflowing creativity, just ideas pouring out.
But the flip side?
Chronic fatigue. And this constant, almost compulsive need for renewal. For multiple projects, it has to keep changing.
Which suddenly makes total sense of her career trajectory. The studio, the school, the podcast, publishing, the lab.
Exactly. Doing the same thing the same way over and over. She says it's just not possible for her brain.
Okay, but running on all cylinders like that.
Yeah.
How do you avoid complete burnout? What does she say is essential?
She's really clear on this. Structure. Rituals. Calm. And she uses this phrase, almost military. mental hygiene.
Almost military. Wow.
Without that kind of scaffolding, she implies it just becomes too much, too fast, unsustainable.
Right. Okay. So you've got this intense attention, the amplified emotions, this deep need for structure. And this is where Pilates comes in, isn't it? She said it saved her.
Yeah, this is maybe one of the most fascinating parts of the interview. She doesn't just talk about Pilates as like good exercise.
It's more than that.
Much more. She says it structures attention within the body.
Within the body. Explain that a bit more. What does that mean practically?
Well, think about that arborescent mind she describes, branching out everywhere, constantly. Pilates acts as an anchor.
Ow.
Every exercise demands focus on breath, on posture, on specific points of support. It constantly pulls the attention back to the present moment, grounded in the physical self.
So you're literally training your attention, but through your body, using physical focus as the mechanism.
Exactly. She calls it embodied neuropedagogy. It's like teaching the brain calm and structure, not just by thinking about it, but by doing it, feeling it physically.
That's really profound.
She even names specific exercises, shoulder bridge, swan prep, shell stretch as her go-tos when her mind feels like it's just spinning out, personal anchors.
Wow. Okay, I can totally see how gaining that understanding would fundamentally change how she teaches Pilates.
Oh, absolutely. She explicitly talks about adapting her pedagogy. Fewer instructions at once, for starters.
Makes sense. Less overwhelm.
Right. And using multisensory cues, visual aids, touch, imaginative language, not just verbal commands.
And room for error.
Crucially, yes. Allowing space for mistakes, for backtracking, even for humor. Recognizing that a straight, linear path of instruction just doesn't work for everyone.
It sounds like she's trying to speak different cognitive languages.
That's a great way to put it. Valuing that nonlinearity in learning. Understanding that the analytical, step-by-step approach isn't the only way, and maybe not even the main way for a lot of people, herself included.
And it seems like even her podcast, the deep dive one she hosts, is part of this system for managing her own way of functioning.
Yes, she mentions that too. It's kind of the perfect format for her. Speaking helps structure her thoughts, right?
Okay.
She can dive deep into topics, allow for those natural tangents that her arborescent mind takes.
But the podcast structure itself forces a return.
Exactly. It requires her to eventually bring it back, to shape the thinking in motion, as she puts it.
It's almost like she's building her thought process out loud, episode by episode. And maybe structuring it for listeners who also think that way.
Yes. People who process information best while they're doing something else, moving, walking, cooking.
That shared cognitive style.
Yeah.
She's creating for that kind of listener, recognizing that need for physical and mental engagement together.
Precisely.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. ADHD often gets linked with low self-esteem. How does she talk about that?
It's interesting. She frames it less as simple low self-esteem and more as an internal disconnect.
Internal disconnect. Tell me more about that. What's the disconnect between?
It's living with this paradox. Feeling brilliant, full of ideas, super creative, and at the exact same time feeling completely overwhelmed, behind on basic stuff, messy, chaotic.
That constant contradiction.
Yeah, and living with that, she says, creates this really deep identity fatigue. Because there's this pressure, right? Pressure to be exceptional because you know you have that potential.
But also pressure to be perfect, irreproachable, to make up for the chaos.
Exactly. To compensate for the perceived defaults, like constantly trying and often feeling like you're failing to just stay within the lines of neurotypical expectations.
That sounds incredibly draining. So the journey then becomes about moving towards what helped her?
Self-compassion, really. Learning to acknowledge the mistakes, yeah, but also to genuinely see and value what she does bring.
Like the energy, the creativity?
The unique presence, instead of always measuring herself against a norm that just fundamentally doesn't fit.
There's that powerful quote from the interview that sums this up so well, in French originally.
Yes, let me find it. Here. Je suis pas moi. Je suis autrement. Et c'est cette différence qui donne du relief à ma pédagogie, à mon art du mouvement et à ma manière de transmettre.
Which for our listeners translates roughly to, I am not less, I am otherwise.
And it is this difference that gives relief, or perhaps depth, or texture, to my pedagogy, to my art of movement, and to my way of transmitting.
I am not less, I am otherwise.
That's such a powerful reframe, embracing the difference. And that's really her core message from this source to others who might hear her story and see themselves. It's incredibly validating.
What is the message exactly?
You're not alone. You're not in default, not broken or defective. You're just organized differently.
And importantly, she stresses that solutions are out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Getting a diagnosis if needed, finding tools, building routines, accessing resources, connecting with people who get it.
And she keeps circling back to movement. That's right.
Ways, Pilates, yoga, dance. She says anything that helps you feel connected to your body, feel in your body,
And order your physical space.
is deeply therapeutic. Essential, even.
Okay, so let's tackle the big question that often comes up. ADHD as a gift. How does the source approach that idea? Because, that framing can be tricky.
It can be, and she acknowledges that complexity.
No.
But her take is essentially, yes, it can be a gift, but, and this is a big but, only if you put in the work to decode its user manual.
So it's not just automatically a superpower. It requires understanding and effort.
Exactly. It's not a free pass. It takes work. It's so often just seen as something to fix, something to correct or medicate away.
And those can be helpful tools. She acknowledges that.
Right. They can be valid parts of the picture. But she argues that ADHD also holds this incredible, she calls it an intelligence of the living. Meaning like a rapid intuition, this capacity for spontaneous creation, for just total emotional engagement when something clicks for you.
That internal fire she mentioned earlier.
Yes. A really powerful engine, a way of being present that she describes, and this phrase is amazing, as brutal but magnificent.
Brutal but magnificent. Wow, that really captures the intensity, the highs and lows. So how did grappling with this brutal magnificence lead her to her life's work?
Well, she essentially says the ADHD forced her. It forced her to figure out her own rhythms, to listen really deeply to what she needed.
And to structure those impulses.
Critically, to structure them so they didn't just run rampant and overwhelm her. It basically compelled this deep dive into self-knowledge, understanding her own neurobiology, developing her nonlinear teaching methods.
And using the body through Pilates as that essential anchor for her hyperactive mind.
Right. So this really challenging experience, this exacting gift, as she calls it wasn't an obstacle to overcome before building her life's work.
It was the foundation of it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
She sees it as this raw talent. Powerful, yes, sometimes overwhelming, definitely needed shaping and containing sometimes.
But never stifling.
Absolutely not, never stifled. And honoring that unique functioning, that otherwise nature, it wasn't about settling for less, it was about unlocking something really significant, something true.
Which ultimately became her contribution, her pedagogy, her creativity.
Her adaptability, her unique way of feeling things. It wasn't an easy path, she implies, but it was a true one for her.
So let's try and pull these threads together. This deep dive into Caroline Berger de Fémynie's interview really gives us this incredibly rich, nuanced picture of adult ADHD.
Yeah, it's about navigating that intense attention, the emotional amplification, the absolute need for structure.
But also, when it's understood and crucially worked with, it can be this huge source of creativity, of intuition, just a unique way of being in the world.
And the power, as she shows so clearly, isn't in trying to force yourself into a mold that doesn't fit. It's in finding the right tools for you.
Like movement, like structure, like that intentional self-knowledge.
Tools to manage the challenges, yes, but also to really embrace the potential that's there.
And it leaves us with this really provocative thought, doesn't it? This idea that embracing your own otherwise nature.
Instead of always striving to be like others or constantly trying to be less chaotic, less intense, less whatever.
But that embrace might actually be the key to unlocking a really powerful and authentic path for yourself.
So maybe the question for you listening is, how might understanding your own unique cognitive style, whatever that style is, allow you to stop wishing you were less?
And instead start honoring, truly honoring, being powerfully, authentically otherwise.